Today, we're talking about thrusting. Now, I know what you think. Not that kind of thrusting. We're talking about the hip thrust. It's one of the best hip exercises, really focusing in on the glutes. We're gonna break down how to do the movement, common mistakes with it, and then some variations of it so that you can grow the best booty possible. So, what is a hip thrust? Well, it's a bridging variation where we have our shoulders elevated. So during the movement, we drive our hips up, really focusing on hip extension, which allows us then to target the glutes since it's one of their primary actions. So what does the hip thrust train? Well, again, it's gonna really emphasize the glutes, in particular the glute max, which is one of our main glute muscles. Then you also get a little bit of glute med emphasis, the one on the side, and that's really gonna be influenced by the way that we execute the movement, which we're gonna talk about later. And then it can also work your quads, your hamstrings, and your back. However, the amount that it's going to work any of those muscles is going to depend upon the technique that you utilize. We're going to explain in this video how to have better technique for the hip thrust so you can target your glute to the best degree. Now, why do I like the hip thrust? I want to explain a few key things that are beneficial about the hip thrust. When we look at the movement, it's really able to effectively target the glutes and when executed well, not be limited by the back or the hamstrings or other muscles. Versus other movements like the squat or the deadlift, when we do these movements, we can go through a rep and we can often find that the glutes aren't going to be challenged to their full degree because the back will often give out. This is really common with the deadlift where individuals will be fatigued, their back gives way, and they aren't able to fully challenge the glutes in the movement. So for the hip thrust, we're able to emphasize the glutes to such a high degree that we aren't going to be limited in challenging it to the full effort. As well, another benefit is that when we look at exercises like squats and deadlifts, we're usually going to be working the glutes to the highest degree in a more hip flexed position, and then as we come up to the top, we're going to decrease the amount of tension that's on them. When you do a squat, once you pass around this point, it becomes relatively easy to finish the rep. For a hip thrust, the most challenging part of the movement is at the top. When we go to finish extending the hip, that's where we put the highest degree of challenge on the glute, and it has to work hardest to finish hip extension. So that's a really beneficial way that we can combine squats, deadlifts with hip thrusts so we work the glutes at peak tensions at different ranges. And then the last thing that can be really good about a hip thrust is when we look at something like a sprinting action. When we have individuals doing high speed running, they come through in this upright position and they swipe and contact the ground, and it's at a relatively extended hip position. And then we're trying to create a horizontal force vector. When you do exercises like squats and deadlifts, we're pushing vertically through the ground and trying to extend the hip, but around hip extension, we're normally not under a lot of load. Whereas with the hip thrust, we have that peak tension as you go to finish a hip extension, and it's a more similar horizontal action with the hip for the vectors demand. So that makes a hip thrust a really beneficial contrast to the squat and deadlift. Now we're going to break down how to actually do the hip thrust. One of the first key steps is finding some sort of option of elevating your shoulders that's an appropriate height. When we're looking at doing the hip thrust to the best degree, we want to be in a level position at the top. So that means I want to try to find some sort of way to elevate my shoulders that allows me to have that horizontal position. So to find that, you want to find some sort of elevated surface that lines up with around this front bone on the front of your shin. This is called your tibial tuberosity. And this lines up in a position that's going to allow you to have that horizontal end position. So for me, this bench works really well. A lot of people will end up finding that a standard bench, is a little bit too high. When you're in a higher position, you'll end up having more of a back extension versus a hip thrust, so that's not ideal. To adjust that, you can elevate your feet, you can lower the bench if possible, or find some sort of other way to elevate your shoulders. On the flip side, if your bench is too low, you'll end up just doing more of a glute bridge, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not quite the goal, but it's better than having something too high. Step 2 is ensuring that your bench is secured. If you're going for your hip thrust and you start to drive up and your bench rocks, that's gonna suck. So what you wanna try to do is either have your bench shifted against something so that it's not gonna be able to rock backwards, or weight it down, or utilize something that's fixed in place. That way you can't do that. Now the next thing we gotta do is figure out where your feet are gonna be. The first aspect of that is figuring out your foot width. If your feet are too narrow, you're gonna have a hard time getting the full effort out of your glutes, and you probably find you can't get full hip extension. I often recommend that individuals think about having their feet hip width apart. So when you look down, you can think my hips are right here. I want to be able to fit my hips between my feet. The second part that we want to consider is your foot rotation. There's been some research looking at the hip thrust and the foot positioning, and they found that by having a slight toe out, it actually increases the amount of glute activation. So by having that slight toe out position, we can encourage more glute usage. And when you think about the fibers of the glute and the way that they run down, it makes sense that when we have our feet a little bit wider and have our toes pointed out, it'll align the fibers to contract harder. The next thing is figuring out a position with your feet distance outwise to allow your shins to be vertical when we drive up. If your feet are too far out or too far in, it's going to take away from the ability to really target the glutes. So when I'm here, I know that for me, this is about the distance I want to be. And then when I go up, I can look at, are my shins relatively vertical? If they're not, then I can take my feet further out, further in to adjust. Then the last thing we want to really think about is where are our shoulders on the bench? I want to try to have my shoulder blades on the top of the bench. If I'm too low, I'm going to have a really hard time getting up. It's just a very uncomfortable position. If I can get my shoulders across, part of why having the right height is so important, I'm going to be able to get in a much better position to then leverage off of and not have pain hip thrusting. So you want to try to set up the right bench height, have your feet in position, and then we're ready to start thrusting. From here, we're now ready to go into the thrust. One of the last details as you're doing the movement you want to consider is trying to crunch and squeeze. What I mean by this is that it's really common for people to go up and really arch and use their back a lot. To mitigate that, what we can think about is as you go up, you can think to do a crunch. That way I'm not arching my back, pointing my chest up. Instead, I keep my chest down, do a little mini crunch, and then squeeze my booty as hard as I can to tilt my pelvis and bring my belt buckle towards my chin, versus a big arch where I don't get full glute engagement. Then I can come down, lower, touch, or not touch, and back up for the next rep. Now we're going to discuss the common mistakes with the hip thrust. The first three that I want to point out are going to be in regards to the foot positioning. It's really common for individuals when they set up to have their feet too far out. And so then when they drive up, their shin isn't vertical, it's on this angle. And what happens is that your hamstrings end up contributing to a high degree. So if you feel your hamstrings working really hard during the hip thrust, I would especially look at what position your feet are and if they're too far out, so then you can just work on bringing them back in, and it'll likely take away from your hamstrings contributing as much during the movement. On the flip side, if your feet are too close in and you have your knees go over your ankle, having that forward angle position, you end up working your quads or can just be limited from your ability to get full hip extension because you're putting your quads in this position where they're really lengthened, doing essentially a rectus femoris stretch. So again, you can take a side view, check it out. If you have that angle, then you can bring your feet further forward and you're good to go. And then the last one is where individuals have their feet too narrow. And this one is really common when people wear those bands around their knees. And what happens is because the band is pulling your knees in really hard and they're not strong enough for it, they just bring their feet closer in. That way they don't have their knees inside. And what we can consistently see in research is that having your knees and feet wider apart actually enables you to have more glute max activation. So ditching the band, going with your feet wider is probably going to be a better position. That way, as you drive up, you're going to have more glute tension by having the fibers aligned. So you want feet in a position to have vertical shins and then wide enough for your hips to fit. The next common mistake that we see individuals make is overarching. I talked about this before in the technique breakdown, but I want to highlight it again. It's really common for people to go up and just focus on driving as high as they can. And as they do that, they're focusing on back extension and not hip extension. Getting higher isn't better. You want to think ribs down and push those hips up, which is a lower height, but it's going to emphasize your butt to a much better degree. So it's going to allow you to get more out of the movement, which is the goal. The second problem that we see with a similar setup is where individuals are going to try to arch really hard and they don't extend their hips the whole way. And even when some people fix this and they keep their ribs down better, they still don't get to full hip extension, whether this is because they're loading it up too much or whatever reason. One of the most valuable parts of this movement is getting to full hip extension, squeezing, locking out those hips. So when you do the movement, emphasize that. Don't cut your reps short, get to that locked out position. Now the hip thrust is a fantastic exercise. One limitation is that body weight alone is not sufficient for most people to get a glute stimulus out of it. So what we want to do is add some sort of external resistance. The first option I'm going to show you is with a dumbbell. So you have a dumbbell, you can get onto your lap, get set up, and then drive. Pretty straightforward. There are a couple limitations with a dumbbell though. The first one is getting it into position can be really hard, especially when it gets heavier. You have to essentially pick it up and over, which is not very easy, especially when you get into heavier loads. Another problem is that as the dumbbell gets bigger, because you add more resistance, it becomes a challenge to get into the bottom position. So instead of utilizing a dumbbell, once you get strong enough, transitioning to a barbell is a much better option. Once you've passed a dumbbell, we can transition to a barbell. A few advantages that come with utilizing a barbell is that if you have bumper plates or you've reached a 135-pound plate, you can just roll this into position really easily. That's a huge advantage, especially as you continue to add more weight. Then you want to utilize a pad when you set up. That way you're not going to be crushing yourself. And so when we get in this position, one of the other benefits shows up is that it's not going to limit my bottom position. I'll be able to descend down without being limited from my hips flex position in contrast to the dumbbell. So then I can get set up. And then I want to try to have my hands down on the bar, not resting up top. Otherwise you'll lose ability to control the bar well. So I have my arms down here. I like to put my elbows against the bench. That way I can keep leverage, keep a little bit extra support, and then drive up. Lock out, go back down. This is one of the best options for progressively overloading the movement across time. In addition to barbells and dumbbells, another option is to utilize band resistance. With band resistance, we're going to have the highest amount of challenge at the top position and not as much challenge in the bottom. To utilize band resistance, there's a few different setups. One is to have your band secured down at both sides, utilizing heavy dumbbells. If you're at a hip thruster, you can hook it onto the station, and whatever other option you can figure out. Then from here, you just drive up as planned, and you can have primary resistance at the top and none at the bottom. So you can really emphasize that lockout position and dial in the glutes. Another way that you can utilize band resistance is where you secure each end of a large band around your feet, and you lap it across your hips, and then from here what you do is you just drive up. This again gives a primary resistance at the top. I will say that this is not nearly as much resistance, but if you have no way to secure a band anywhere else, this is a reasonable way to try to get some additional resistance. Another way that you can add some external resistance is with a band on your knees. These have become really popular in the recent years, and you can add this in addition to other resistance types, like you can have a band on your knees, and you can also use a barbell or a dumbbell, etc. Now, it's important that when we look at this, is that we consider how strong of resistance this is. Most bands that are on the market are probably too strong. And the reason I say this is that when we're looking at the hip thrust, and the primary benefit that we get from it is on that hip extension action. So when we're driving up, and if you're utilizing a band where you have to really focus on driving out to stop your knees from caving in, you lose the benefit of this exercise. Because as I discussed earlier, if your knees are closer in, you won't be able to get the optimal line for your glutes to fire and really have the best tension on them. So instead of having a really strong band, we can ditch that. We can go to a band like this one. This is from Committed HP. This is a really solid band because what you can do is it has the ability to change the resistance on it. So I'm going to take it to the lightest resistance. And then I can put it on. And as you can see, it has some resistance, but it's not going to overload me. So I could have my barbell in place. I could have this here. Then as I go up, I have a little bit of extra resistance through the motion, which can then aid and add on to developing my glutes to a higher level. If you find that you're not able to set up any of these, another way that you can make the hip thrust more challenging is by going to a single leg. What I can do here is I can either have my leg straight out and I can drive up, or I can keep my leg tucked in, which is my preferred option. By having the leg tucked in and driving up, I'm able to keep a nice good challenge on the side, not be limited by my hip flexibility or my hip flexor strength, and really focus on this leg. You can try having your arms up to the side on this. I know earlier I mentioned not doing that because it'll take away from the ability to hold on to a barbell. But while you're doing this exercise, you don't want to have such a high demand on your balance and resisting rotation. So by keeping your elbows out to the side, you can really focus on driving up and down and dialing in the effort on your glute. So it's a good way that we can challenge and put a little bit more demand on the glute without adding more external resistance. Sweet boy. And that's gonna be a breakdown on the hip thrust, how to do it, common mistakes with it, and some variations for different ways that you can load it up. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button down below. Make sure to subscribe for more content. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, leave a comment down below. See you in the next video.